The Secret Beneath the Hollyhocks, a Miss Marple Mystery. Section 1. The Hollyhocks at Blackthornne Cottage. St. Mary Mead had a way of waking slowly, as though reluctant to admit that another day required its attention. On the morning of the 12th of June, the mist lifted from the water meadows at a leisurely pace, church bells trailed their notes across the rooftops, and old Mr. Podgett's cart rattled down the lane with an air of comfortable inevitability. In her front garden, Miss Jane Marple was tying up her sweet peas, a shawl about her shoulders, and a pair of secateurs, most companionably, in her right hand. It was to this scene of undisturbed sweetness that the disturbance came, as disturbances so often do in villages, in the form of a running child. Young Tommy Bassett came pelting down the lane in his stockinged feet, his boots swinging from one fist, his other hand clutching his cap. He stopped only when he had reached Miss Marple's gate, and even then he seemed to have some difficulty in remembering how one begins a sentence. "Please, Miss Marple," he said at last, "please, the hollyhocks at Blackthornne Cottage, they've fallen over. All of them, and there's someone in them." Miss Marple laid down her secateurs very carefully upon the low garden wall. She looked for one quiet moment at the boy's white face, and then at the row of her own hollyhocks, tall, pink, faintly nodding, as though seeking counsel from them. "Someone, Tommy dear," she said. "Do you mean Mrs. Ashcombe has been unwell?" Tommy shook his head with a violence that dislodged a fragment of hedgerow from his hair. "Not Mrs. Ashcombe, miss. It's the gentleman who came Tuesday. He's lying in the flowers with his eyes open, and he isn't looking at anything." Miss Marple's hand closed briefly on the top of the garden wall. There was, in that small pressure, the entirety of a long life spent in the observance of tragedies whose shape she had learned to recognize before they were named. She looked once more at her hollyhocks, and there passed across her face a shadow that had nothing to do with the mist. "Go to the vicarage, Tommy," she said. "Ask the Reverend Ashby to telephone Inspector Slack at Much Benham. And then, my dear, sit in the vicarage kitchen and let Mrs. Ashby give you a piece of shortbread. Do not run back." The boy tore away. Miss Marple, in her tidy grey coat and small violet hat, walked down her own path, closed her gate with the customary care, and set off at an unhurried but not unhurried pace along the lane that led to Blackthornne Cottage. Blackthornne Cottage sat at the far end of the village, where the lane bent and the elms closed over the roadway. It was a low, whitewashed house with a thatched roof of a rather melancholy sag, and it had been for the past 3 years the residence of Mrs. Cordelia Ashcombe, widow of the late Major Ashcombe, and, since Tuesday, of the gentleman visitor whose name, on the register at the King's Arms, had been given as Mr. Edmund Locksley. Mr. Locksley had arrived by the afternoon train, with 2 leather trunks, a manner of easy charm, and an umbrella he did not once open. He had introduced himself at the vicarage tea as a distant cousin of dear Cordelia's, come to sort some family papers, and had smiled at Mrs. Price Ridley in a way that had caused that lady to spend a full hour the following morning in the discussion of what she variously called his eyes and his ways. Miss Marple had said nothing, but had, in the manner of an old gardener studying an unfamiliar seedling, watched him lift his teacup with his left hand, while his right lay flat and still upon his knee. Now, in the front garden of Blackthornne Cottage, the hollyhocks lay flattened along one side of the path, as though some sudden weight had passed through them. Miss Marple, at the gate, took in the whole of the scene before she stepped through it, the front door standing slightly ajar, a pair of gentlemen's shoes laid neatly side by side just within the porch, Mrs. Ashcombe herself sitting on the low stone bench by the door with her hands folded in her lap, her hair not quite pinned, and a small tear in the lace at her wrist. "Cordelia, my dear," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Ashcombe raised her eyes. They were very fine eyes, dark and clear, and they had in them at that moment neither the wildness of shock nor the emptiness of grief, but a stillness that Miss Marple had encountered only twice before in her life. Both occasions, on reflection, had ended in a hanging. "Jane," said Mrs. Ashcombe, "I telephoned no one. I sat down. I could not think what to do." "Tommy Bassett has gone to the vicarage," Miss Marple said gently. "Inspector Slack will be here presently. Shall we sit together?" She did not, at that moment, look at the hollyhocks. She looked instead at Mrs. Ashcombe's hands, which lay very quietly in her lap, and at the small tear in the lace, which was fresh and which had not been mended. Down the path, between the flattened stalks, lay Mr. Edmund Locksley. He had fallen on his back, one arm flung out into the pink and cream ruin, the other folded across his chest as though he had been in the act of reaching for something at his breast. His eyes were, as Tommy had said, open. There was, on the linen of his shirt, a small dark stain no larger than a florin, and about him a faint scent of lavender water, and beneath it something both sharper and more suggestive, the fresh, green smell of broken hollyhock stems. Miss Marple, still holding Mrs. Ashcombe's cold hand in her own, permitted her gaze to travel very briefly to a single detail. At Mr. Locksley's right shoulder, one hollyhock had not been flattened. It stood upright still, tall and pink, and at the base of its stem lay a small object, a lady's hairpin, of an old-fashioned tortoiseshell pattern, unbent and clean. She looked at it for the length of one heartbeat. Then she looked away, and her face resumed its expression of gentle, distressed concern. "Cordelia," she said quietly, "when did you last see Mr. Locksley alive?" Mrs. Ashcombe drew a very long breath. "At breakfast, Jane. He took his coffee in the garden, as he liked to do. I went upstairs to see to the linen. I heard nothing at all." "Nothing at all," Miss Marple repeated, in a voice so gentle that it might have been the wind in the elms. In the lane, a bicycle bell rang once, sharply. Constable Polk was pedalling towards them, at a pace which suggested that the vicarage telephone had been used with unusual dispatch. Behind him, dust rose from the direction of Much Benham. A motor car was coming. Miss Marple pressed Mrs. Ashcombe's hand and rose. She stood a moment in the garden, small and grey and very still, and looked one last time at the tortoiseshell hairpin lying at the foot of the single upright hollyhock. In her mind, quite without her volition, there rose the image of her own great-aunt Emily, who had used just such pins, and who had once observed, over a cup of tea, and with the sweetness of a woman speaking of the weather, that the surest way to know a liar was to notice which of their hands remained still. A hollyhock, Miss Marple thought, is a very tall flower. It is not easily broken by accident, and a woman who has heard nothing at all is often a woman who has been listening with all her might. She turned towards the gate as Constable Polk dismounted, and her face was once more the face of a village lady in mild distress, but her heart at that moment had begun the slow, sad accounting for which it had been made. Section 2. The Village Reacts. Constable Polk leaned his bicycle against the gatepost with the peculiar care of a man who suspects he is about to become an anecdote. He removed his helmet, tucked it under his arm, and advanced up the path with the studied gravity of the recently promoted. Behind him, in the lane, the dust from Much Benham resolved itself into the black Austin belonging to Inspector Slack, who alighted at speed and slammed the door with more emphasis than the moment required. "Miss Marple," said the inspector, by way of grim greeting, "you have a knack of being on the spot." "I was in my garden," Miss Marple replied, with a small, apologetic smile. "The boy came running. I only sat with Cordelia." Inspector Slack looked, for a moment, as though he might say something sharp, but the sight of Mr. Locksley among the hollyhocks arrested him. He walked down the path with Constable Polk at his heels, and the two men bent together over the fallen figure in a silence which Miss Marple, standing by the low stone bench with her hands still upon Mrs. Ashcombe's shoulder, did not attempt to break. Word, meanwhile, had begun its own accustomed circuit. Tommy Bassett, though he had been given shortbread and a firm instruction, had also been given, in the manner of small boys, a mouth. By the time the inspector's Austin had come to rest at the Blackthornne gate, Mrs. Price Ridley knew, and by the time Constable Polk had finished his first slow circuit of the flower bed, 3 separate versions of the affair were already in flight above the hedges of St. Mary Mead. At the post office, Miss Hartnell, a large, weather-beaten woman with a habit of speaking as though addressing a public meeting, announced to Mrs. Weatherby that Mr. Locksley had been stabbed to the heart with a garden fork. At the King's Arms, Mrs. Fletcher told the milkman that the poor gentleman had been struck down with an iron bar, most likely by a passing tramp. At the vicarage, Mrs. Ashby, distributing shortbread with a shaking hand, ventured only that something very dreadful had happened at Blackthornne, and dear Miss Marple was there, which was a comfort. Miss Marple, walking home an hour later along the lane, was aware of the village's excitement, as an old shepherd is aware of a change of weather. At every gate a figure detached itself, from every hedge a voice inquired, and to each in turn she gave the same gentle, non-committal reply. Inspector Slack is at Blackthornne. Poor Cordelia is very shaken. It is best not to speculate. It was, of course, exactly the reply calculated to guarantee that speculation would continue undiminished, and Miss Marple knew it perfectly well. She had lived too long among villages to imagine that a phrase could dam a flood. What she desired at that moment was not silence, but noise, for the wrong sort of noise, in her experience, was often the surest guide to the right sort of truth. By tea-time, the theories had ripened. Mrs. Price Ridley had settled upon the tramp with the firmness of a woman who has decided to be right. Miss Weatherby, with an almost audible tremor of pleasure, had put forward a jealous husband, although she was unable, on being pressed, to name a wife. Colonel Bantry, encountered by Miss Marple upon the corner by the Blue Boar, offered the opinion that these fellows who come down from town with too much charm generally have too much debt, and touched his hat with a firmness that concluded the interview. At the vicarage, where Miss Marple had been persuaded to take a cup of tea by an anxious Mrs. Ashby, the theories arranged themselves in more elegant form. The Reverend Ashby, a tall, mild man with a habit of pressing his fingertips together, expressed himself with the careful neutrality proper to his cloth. "One cannot help feeling," he said, "that Mr. Locksley was a man of secrets. He came from London. He arrived, if I may say so, with a certain flourish. There was in him, I say this with charity, a suggestion of the theatre." "He was very charming," said Mrs. Ashby, with the particular sigh of a woman who has been charmed against her better judgment. "He was very charming," Miss Marple agreed, and set down her cup with great gentleness. "Cordelia said he had come to sort family papers. That is a phrase which, in my experience, is more often used than papers are actually sorted." The Reverend Ashby glanced at her sharply, and then, remembering himself, glanced away. Mrs. Ashby, undeterred, leaned forward. "Jane," she said, "who could have done such a thing?" "I could not possibly say, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "But I do observe that a garden is a very public place, and that the person who kills in a garden either knows the household very well indeed, or does not care in the least who sees." There was a small silence, into which Mrs. Ashby's clock ticked, and from which the Reverend Ashby extracted himself by rising to fetch more hot water. By evening, the village had produced its cast. There was, first, the vanished chauffeur of the Ashcombes, a man named Ralston, who had left Mrs. Ashcombe's employ some 5 months before, under circumstances which Mrs. Price Ridley considered very shady indeed. There was the young man from the Grange, Mr. Julian Vane, who had been observed, on more than one occasion, walking along the lane towards Blackthornne at an hour which no one, however uncharitable, could describe as neighbourly. And there was, of course, the tramp, whom nobody had actually seen, but everyone was sure had been about. Miss Marple sat, that evening, in her drawing-room, with her knitting in her lap and her spectacles pushed a little down her nose. The hollyhocks in the vase upon her table nodded gently in the draught from the window. She thought of Mrs. Ashcombe's hands, folded so quietly, of the small tear in the lace, unmended, of the tortoise-shell hairpin lying, unbent and clean, at the foot of the one upright flower. She thought too of Mr. Locksley's right hand, which at the vicarage tea had lain flat and still upon his knee. It had, she remembered, worn no ring, and yet there had been a faint, pale line upon the third finger, where a ring had lately been. A man who removes a ring before coming into a village, she reflected, is often a man who wishes to seem what he is not, and a woman who does not weep for such a man is often a woman who has already wept, in private, for something else. The clock in the hall struck 9. Miss Marple laid down her knitting, walked to the window, and drew the curtain a little to one side. The lane was very quiet. The last light lay along the ridges of the roofs. A single lamp burned at the Blue Boar, and at the far end of the lane, where Blackthornne Cottage stood among its elms, one window showed a faint, steady glow. Cordelia Ashcombe, thought Miss Marple, was sitting up. She let the curtain fall and returned to her chair. Upon her knitting she resumed the small, patient stitches which had accompanied her through so many such evenings. In the pattern before her, a rose was beginning to take shape, but she was scarcely aware of it. She was, in the private theatre of her mind, arranging a little cast which the village had provided her. The widow, the young man from the Grange, the vanished chauffeur, the tramp, and behind them, taller than any of them, a single hollyhock, unbroken, at the shoulder of a dead man. There was, Miss Marple thought, a most particular kind of quiet that follows a lie well told. St. Mary Mead was full of it tonight. Section 3. The Inspector's Compass. Morning brought Inspector Slack back to the village at 9:15, in a mood midway between briskness and irritation. He had spent the night with the police surgeon, the telephone at Much Benham, and a folder of preliminary reports which had refused, in his opinion, to arrange themselves in any pattern intelligible to a busy man. He drew up outside the Blue Boar, where the landlord had had the presence of mind to reserve him a private parlour, and there he set out his notebook, his pipe, and, because he could not, in his own house of thought, quite ignore her, a chair for Miss Marple, whom he had, with considerable reluctance, invited to be present. "You understand, Miss Marple," he said, seating himself with a small creak of leather, "that this is entirely irregular." "Oh, entirely," Miss Marple agreed, and folded her hands upon her lap. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "The police surgeon puts death between 9:30 and 10:30 yesterday morning. Cause? A single wound made with a slender, sharp instrument entering between the ribs and reaching the heart. Not a knife of any usual kind. Something more like, well, more like a hatpin, if you follow me, only stronger." "A stiletto, perhaps," Miss Marple offered mildly. "Or a very fine skewer, or an ice pick. I have read of such things in the papers." "Quite. Nothing of the kind has been found upon the premises." "How very tidy," said Miss Marple. The inspector regarded her for a moment. He had, in the course of previous acquaintance, learned to distrust her mildness, and yet each fresh encounter renewed his hope that this time she would perhaps be merely elderly. It was a hope that had, thus far, survived only until she opened her mouth. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he went on, consulting his notes, "states that she was upstairs. She heard nothing. She came down at 11 to lay a cold luncheon, went into the garden to gather parsley, and found the deceased." "She was very composed when I arrived," Miss Marple said. "She was. Almost, one might say, prepared." "That is a strong word, Miss Marple." "It is only," said Miss Marple, "that I have noticed that persons who are truly overtaken by shock rarely think to sit down upon a bench. They stand where they are. They lean on things. Sometimes they walk in circles. Cordelia was sitting quite still, with her hands folded." The inspector wrote something in his notebook which he underlined twice. "There is," he continued, "the matter of the deceased's history. Edmund Locksley is not, so far as we can discover, a real name. The trunks in his room contain clothes of good quality, but no papers of any consequence. There is a passport, in the name of Locksley, issued 3 months ago, and there is a bundle of letters, tied with black ribbon, addressed to a Mrs. Ashcombe at this address, dated between March and May of this year." "How very interesting," Miss Marple said gently. "They are not, however," said the inspector, "in the handwriting of Mrs. Ashcombe, nor are they signed by Locksley. They are signed, 'Your ever devoted E.'" "E," Miss Marple repeated. "Which, of course," the inspector said, with a small note of triumph, "may stand for Edmund." "Or," said Miss Marple, "for Ellen, or Eleanor, or indeed for Edith. It is a very common initial, dear Inspector. My own cousin was called Eustace, and he was never guilty of anything more serious than drafts." The inspector, ignoring this, produced a second folder. "Now," he said, "as regards our suspects. There is first Mr. Julian Vane of the Grange, aged 28, of independent means, a nephew of the late Colonel Vane. He was observed in the lane on the evening before the death, and again on the morning itself, at a time not established. He is said to have been on terms of some, warmth with Mrs. Ashcombe. Second, there is one Ralston, formerly her chauffeur, dismissed in January, present whereabouts unknown, but believed by the yard to be at large in the county under an alias. Third, a longer shot, a woman answering to the description of a Mrs. Verity Thorne, of London, was seen at Much Benham Station on Monday. She is a person of interest to us in another matter, and Locksley's name has been connected to hers. 3 suspects, Miss Marple said, and a widow. Miss Marple: I only observe, Inspector, one so often has a widow. Inspector Slack shut his notebook with a small snap. I am inclined, he said, to Mr. Julian Vane. He had opportunity. He had, on the village's own testimony, motive, and when Constable Polk called upon him yesterday afternoon, he was, I put it no higher than this, extremely composed. Composure, Miss Marple murmured, is such a difficult thing to interpret. You would suspect Mrs. Ashcombe, I take it. I would suspect no one until I understood the Hollyhocks, said Miss Marple, and then, seeing the inspector's expression, she smiled apologetically. Forgive me, an old woman's foolishness. It was only that the flowers had been trodden down on one side of the path but not the other, and one flower, at Mr. Locksley's shoulder, had not been trodden at all. It occurred to me that a man who is struck down does not usually fall in a way that leaves so tidy a shape. The inspector paused with his pipe half raised. You mean he was moved? I mean, Miss Marple said, that he was arranged. There was a small, careful silence. Then the inspector rose, put on his hat, and said with a certain gruff courtesy, Miss Marple, I shall be at Blackthornne again at 11. Should you happen to be passing— I so often happen, said Miss Marple, to be passing. She rose too, and gathered her small handbag, and as she went out into the sunlight of the village square, she paused a moment to look at the hollyhocks that grew, tall and pink, against the wall of the Blue Boar. They stood in a neat row, unbroken, and yet as Miss Marple looked at them, she found herself thinking not of these flowers, but of the one upright bloom at Blackthorne, and of the tortoise-shell hairpin which had lain at its foot. She walked slowly along the lane towards Blackthorne Cottage. The inspector, in his motor car, had gone on ahead, and the village was resuming, in its accustomed way, the various small activities of a summer morning. The butcher's boy on his bicycle, the vicar's cat upon a wall, Mrs. Price Ridley's parlour-maid shaking a duster in a shaft of sun. At the bend of the lane, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Julian Vane. He was a tall young man, well made, with the good clothes and negligent bearing of one who has never had to earn them. He raised his hat with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes and said, Miss Marple, may I walk with you as far as the Grange gate? I should be very glad, Mr. Vane. They walked together for some yards in silence. It was Mr. Vane who broke it. I understand, he said, that Inspector Slack has been asking after me. He seems to feel my morning walks are of interest. Inspector Slack, Miss Marple said gently, has a very inquiring mind. Mr. Vane laughed, a short, unhappy laugh. One would think a man might walk in his own village without being suspected of murder. One would, Miss Marple agreed. One would think a great many things, Mr. Vane, that turn out not to be so. He glanced down at her. In his face there was, for a moment, something young and startled and unhappy, as though the small, polite lady beside him had, without raising her voice, taken his measure to the 16th of an inch. Then the shutter fell. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said at the Grange gate. Good morning, Mr. Vane. She walked on, alone, along the lane. She did not turn to look after him. She was not thinking at that moment of Mr. Julian Vane at all. She was thinking of Cordelia Ashcombe, sitting very still upon a stone bench, with her hands folded and a small tear in the lace at her wrist. Section 4. A convenient suspect. The lane bore Miss Marple gently towards Blackthorne Cottage, and thence, by an equally gentle turn of thought, towards the disposition of Inspector Slack's mind. It was a mind she had encountered before. It liked corners it could see round. It disliked corners that receded. When such a mind was presented with a young man of independent means, a widow of some beauty, and a village willing to swear that the two had been observed together in a lane at an unusual hour, the corner appeared, to its owner, to be entirely visible. At Blackthorne, the inspector's Austin stood again at the gate. Constable Polk, with the air of a man who has been given a rope and a very large field, was measuring things in the front garden. 2 of the hollyhocks had been laid, wilting, upon a sheet of newspaper. A third stood, still upright, at the edge of the flower-bed, its neighbouring stalks flattened about it like a courtly bow. The tortoise-shell hairpin had gone. Mrs. Ashcombe received them in the parlour. She was dressed in dove grey, her hair pinned severely, and though her eyes were shadowed, she had the composure that Miss Marple had noted the day before, only tempered now by fatigue. She rose when Miss Marple was shown in, and pressed her hand. "Jane, it is kind of you to come. I would come every day if you would allow me, Cordelia." "I should be glad," Mrs. Ashcombe said quietly, "of the company." The inspector from the window cleared his throat. "If you please, Mrs. Ashcombe, a few more questions." "Of course." He drew a chair, opened his notebook, and proceeded, with the tact of a man rolling a barrel over a lawn, to explore the ground on which he had already fixed. Where had she been at 9:30? Upstairs. What was she doing? Sorting linen. Had anyone called at the house before 11? No one. That is, the postman had come at 10, as he did every day, but he had left the letters on the porch step, as she had asked him to do since the death of her husband, and he had not spoken to her. And Mr. Julian Vane, said the inspector. Mr. Vane did not call at the house yesterday. But on other days? On previous days? Mrs. Ashcombe's hand moved once upon the arm of her chair, and stilled. Yes. Frequently? He is a neighbour, and he was very kind after Major Ashcombe's death. How kind? Asked the inspector. There was a small silence. Mrs. Ashcombe said, He was kind, that is all. Mrs. Ashcombe, the inspector said, I have to put this to you plainly. It has been said in the village that you and Mr. Vane were on terms which exceeded the neighbourly. It has been said that Mr. Locksley, on his arrival, made a scene with reference to that fact. Is any of this so? She lifted her chin very slightly, and Miss Marple, watching from her chair by the door, was struck by the fine, private courage of the movement. Cordelia Ashcombe had been, in her youth, considered a great beauty. In her middle age, she carried the remains of it with something more affecting than beauty itself. Mr. Vane and I, she said, have been friends. There has been no scene. Mr. Locksley, pursued the inspector, was he not, in fact, a claimant against the Ashcombe estate? He was, a claimant in a certain sense. My husband left affairs which were complicated. Mr. Locksley believed he had a share in one of them. I do not know whether he was right. He came here, as he said, to look at papers. And he stayed in this house. He was a cousin. There is a spare room. And Mr. Vane, on being told of his arrival. Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes did not lower. Mr. Vane was displeased. How displeased? He is a young man. He was displeased. The inspector wrote in his notebook. Miss Marple, still and small in her chair, was aware, as she was always aware in such rooms, of 100 trifles. The way Mrs. Ashcombe's left hand held the arm of the chair too tightly, while her right lay open in her lap. The very faint scent in the room of lavender water, Mr. Locksley's, mingled with a woman's cologne which she did not know. The fact that on the mantel there stood 2 photographs, one of the late Major Ashcombe in uniform, the other of a young woman in a dress of the late 90s, whom Miss Marple did not recognise. Who, she asked mildly, in the small pause, is the lady on the mantelpiece, Cordelia? Forgive me, I do not think I have seen her before. Mrs. Ashcombe turned her head. For a moment, Miss Marple saw a flicker cross her face. Not fear, not exactly grief, but something older and more private. That is Edith, Mrs. Ashcombe said. My husband's sister. She died a long time ago. Ah, said Miss Marple, and again more softly. Ah. The inspector, who had been on the point of pursuing Mr. Vane down a further lane of interrogation, glanced at Miss Marple with some annoyance and returned to his subject. Mrs. Ashcombe, where was Mr. Vane yesterday morning between 9 and 11? I do not know, Inspector. He states he was walking on the downs. That is possible. Alone? That is his affair. Quite, said the inspector, and something in his tone suggested that he considered this line of questioning very nearly conclusive. He rose. Constable Polk appeared at the parlour door. There was a brief consultation, at the end of which Constable Polk withdrew, and the inspector announced, with the peculiar formality that policemen reserve for what they believe to be triumph, that Mr. Julian Vane had been asked to accompany him to Much Benham for further questioning. Mrs. Ashcombe rose too. Inspector, he did not do this. That, madam, is what we shall determine. He bowed in his brisk way and went out. The parlour door closed. The lane outside received first Constable Polk's bicycle, then the Austin, and then a long, listening silence. Mrs. Ashcombe sank down upon the sofa. For the first time since the morning of the tragedy, she wept. It was a quiet weeping, without noise, without struggle. Her shoulders shook, and her hands at last unclenched in her lap. Miss Marple crossed the room and sat beside her. She did not embrace her. She placed her small, dry hand upon Mrs. Ashcombe's wrist, over the tear in the lace, which had still not been mended. Cordelia, she said, Julian did not kill him. Mrs. Ashcombe turned her wet face. How can you say so, Jane? Because, Miss Marple said, with her habitual gentleness, the flower at Mr. Locksley's shoulder was not broken, and Mr. Vane, my dear, is a tall young man, given to broad strides. He would have broken it. Whoever laid Mr. Locksley in the Hollyhocks was a person of smaller stature who moved carefully and who knew that flower well enough to spare it. Mrs. Ashcombe stared. Her weeping had ceased, but there was in her eyes an expression which Miss Marple had seen before, the expression of a woman who has heard something she did not expect to hear and is not yet sure whether she is grateful or afraid. Jane, she whispered, whom do you suspect? Miss Marple's own eyes had gone for a moment to the photograph on the mantel, to the young woman in the dress of the late 90s, whose name was Edith, and whose face bore, if one looked with a certain quiet steadiness, a family resemblance to no one in the room. I do not yet suspect, she said. I only wonder, Cordelia, why the hollyhock at Mr. Locksley's shoulder was permitted to stand. Section 5. The Hairpin and the Ledger. Cordelia Ashcombe did not answer at once. She sat with her hands loose in her lap and her gaze turned inward, as though listening to a bell tolling in another room. Then, slowly, she looked up again. Jane, there is something I have not told the inspector. Miss Marple's small, dry hand did not leave her wrist. Then perhaps, my dear, you will tell me. Mr. Locksley, said Mrs. Ashcombe, was not my cousin. I did not, Miss Marple said, suppose that he was. He was. He was a man from my husband's past. My husband, when he was young and less careful than he became, had a connection with a lady in London, a lady who bore a child. Mr. Locksley was that child. He came to me last year with letters and a ring and the story. He asked for money. You gave it. I gave it. Not because I feared what he would say. I do not care now what is said. My husband is dead. I gave it because I knew when I saw him that he was telling the truth. He had my husband's mouth. There is a way my husband had of holding a teacup. Mr. Locksley held it in the same way. Left hand, Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Ashcombe looked at her a moment. Left hand, yes. And the letters, Cordelia? There are 2 bundles. The bundle the inspector found is one. Those are letters from Edith, from my sister-in-law, written to my husband long ago when they were both young. Edith was not always well. She wrote to him in a way that was not quite the way a sister writes to a brother. Miss Marple was silent. She had, on her first coming to St. Mary Mead many years ago, heard from old Miss Weatherby some fragment of a story concerning the Ashcombes and a sister who had died abroad. She had, as one does, put it aside. She was not putting it aside now. The other bundle, Mrs. Ashcombe went on, I have kept. Mr. Locksley had never seen it. It is in my writing desk, in the study, in the second drawer from the top. I should like you, Jane, if you will, to read it, and to tell me what should be done. I will read it, Miss Marple said. They went, together, along the passage to the study. It was a small, book-lined room, with a window giving upon the back garden. Mrs. Ashcombe unlocked the drawer and drew out a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and beneath them a small black leather ledger no bigger than a prayer book. The letters are Edith's, she said. The ledger was my husband's. He kept it privately. I only found it after his death. She placed both into Miss Marple's hands and turned away to the window, as though she could not bear to see them opened. Miss Marple, at the small writing table, sat down. The letters, when she untied them, were brief and had been written in a hand that grew, from earliest to latest, more disordered. They were not, as Mrs. Ashcombe had said, the letters of a sister to a brother. They were the letters of a young woman shut, by degrees, into a private darkness, and appealing, in that darkness, to the one person she believed capable of hearing her. There was, in the last letter of all, a passage which Miss Marple read twice, and then a third time. You will say I have imagined it, Edith had written. You will say Cordelia is your wife and cannot have done these things. But I tell you, Henry, she has taken the little pin from my dressing table, and I know why she has taken it. She looks at me with such a smile. I am afraid. If I am found in a bed of flowers with a small wound in my breast, remember that I told you it would be so. Your Edith. Miss Marple laid the letter down very carefully upon the desk. She placed her hands, one on top of the other, upon it, as though to keep it still. Cordelia, she said quietly, When did Edith die? In the summer of 1902, Mrs. Ashcombe said, without turning from the window. At our house in Northumberland. She was found in the garden. There was an inquest. She had been ill. It was decided that she had taken her own life. There was a small wound. It was believed she had used a garden implement. My husband never spoke of it after. You were in the house? I was in the house. I was young then, Jane. I was newly married. I was afraid of her. She frightened me. She said dreadful things. But I did not. I did not. Her voice failed. She stood at the window with her back very straight and did not turn. Miss Marple did not press her. She opened the black leather ledger. It contained, in the small, precise hand of the late Major Ashcombe, a private accounting of sums paid, over more than 20 years, to a series of persons whose initials and payments were noted month by month. The last 3 years contained the recurring entries L. £50, and less frequently L. £75. The very last such entry was dated the 3rd of June, 10 days before Mr. Locksley's death. Beneath the last entry, in a different, hastier hand, a woman's, was written a single line, "No more. C." Miss Marple closed the ledger. "Cordelia," she said, "did you tell Mr. Locksley there would be no more?" "I told him," Mrs. Ashcombe said, still without turning, "that I could not go on paying, that the estate would not bear it, that he must accept a final sum and go. He said he would consider it, and then he came here. He said he would consider it here." "And you were afraid," Miss Marple said gently. "I was afraid. I was not afraid of him, Jane. I was afraid of myself. I was afraid because I knew, when I saw him among my flowers, that I hated him. I had never hated anyone before. It was as if some old feeling, some old inclination, had risen up in me that I did not know was there." She turned then. Her face was very white. Her hands hung loosely at her sides. "Do you think," she whispered, "that I killed him?" Miss Marple sat for a long moment, her hands still upon Edith's last letter. Then she rose, and she gathered the letters and the ledger together, and she said, in her ordinary voice, "I think, Cordelia, that you have carried something for a very long time that was not yours to carry. I think it is possible you have been made, by another person, to believe things of yourself that are not true. I think we shall know more when we know why the hollyhock at Mr. Locksley's shoulder was permitted to stand, and why the little hairpin was left at its foot." Mrs. Ashcombe stared at her. "The hairpin?" "A tortoiseshell hairpin, Cordelia, very old-fashioned, of a pattern I have not seen worn by any lady of St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Ashcombe put her hand to her throat. "That was Edith's," she said. "Edith's own. I have kept them, in a box in the attic. They were my husband's. He could not part with them. Jane, someone has been in the attic of this house." Miss Marple did not at that moment reply. She was thinking of the hollyhocks along her own garden wall, and of the way the wind that morning had moved among them, not violently, but with a certain purposefulness, as though it were choosing which flower to bend. She was thinking of the widow at the window, and of the young man from the Grange being driven at that hour to Much Benham, and of the small tear in the lace, unmended. "Cordelia," she said gently, "we shall go up to the attic together. But first, my dear, you will drink a cup of tea, and you will sit down. There is a great deal we do not yet understand, and it is my experience that a great deal that seems certain is only what someone else has wished us to think." She placed the letters and the ledger back into the drawer, and turned the key, and dropped the key into her own small handbag. And when she gave Cordelia Ashcombe her arm, and led her back down the passage to the parlour, she was aware, for the first time since the morning of the flower-bed, of a shape beginning to form itself in her mind. A shape that was not the shape of a young man, nor of a widow, nor of a tramp, but of someone who had used all three, most patiently, for a very long time. Section 6. Cracks in the facades. The kettle in Cordelia Ashcombe's kitchen sang its small domestic song, and Miss Marple, moving with the practised ease of one who has made many cups of tea in other women's houses, warmed the pot and measured the leaves. She did not speak until the cups were poured. Nor did she ask further questions of Mrs. Ashcombe, who sat at the scrubbed table with her palms flat upon the wood, breathing slowly and deliberately, like a swimmer come up from a great depth. "Drink, my dear," Miss Marple said, "and then we shall go up." The attic at Blackthornne was reached by a narrow stair that climbed from the back landing. It was low-ceilinged, with a single small window under the thatch, and it smelled of old linen and dust, and the faintly bitter aroma of dried lavender. Trunks and boxes stood along one wall. A rocking horse, missing one ear, kept watch beneath the eaves. Mrs. Ashcombe went at once to a small tin trunk banded in black, which stood a little apart from the rest. "This was Edith's," she said. "My husband kept it locked. The key is here." She drew from a nail in the rafter a small brass key and knelt and opened the trunk. Miss Marple, standing beside her, saw within it the ordinary poor accumulation of a young woman's life. A folded shawl, a Bible with a green marker, a bundle of white gloves tied with tape, and, at one end, a small enamelled box. Mrs. Ashcombe opened the box. Within it lay, upon a bed of red velvet, some dozen tortoise-shell hairpins. She stared. "Count them, Cordelia," Miss Marple said gently. "There were 14, Mrs. Ashcombe whispered. "I counted them once, years ago. There should be 14. "There are 12. "Yes, there are 12. They looked at each other across the little enamelled box. Miss Marple's face was very calm. Mrs. Ashcombe's was less so. "Someone," said Miss Marple, "has been up here. Not, I think, yesterday. This dust," she brushed a finger along the rim of the trunk, "is undisturbed. It was some time ago. Perhaps weeks. Perhaps longer." "Who," said Mrs. Ashcombe, "would come to my attic?" "That, my dear, is one of the questions we shall have to consider. But now, I think, we shall lock the trunk again, and we shall put the key in your pocket, not upon the rafter, and we shall go down." They descended in silence. In the parlour, the clock ticked. On the mantel, Edith's photograph looked out with its faded, listening eyes. Miss Marple did not, at that moment, allow herself to think of the missing pins. She allowed herself, instead, to think of the persons who might, in the past year or so, have had ordinary business in the house. The parlour-maid, the postman, the vicar's wife, the doctor, Mr. Vane, Mr. Loxley himself, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had called, of course, when Cordelia's cold had lasted a fortnight, and Miss Hartnell, who called upon everyone. None of them, so far as she could see, would climb to an attic and count pins in a dead woman's box. She rose and pressed Mrs. Ashcombe's hand. "I shall go and see one or two people. Do not, my dear, go out. Do not answer the door. If the inspector returns, tell him I have gone to the vicarage." "Yes, Jane." "And Cordelia." "Yes." "Have the maid come and sit with you." She went out into the sunlight of the lane. The village received her, as it had received her the day before, with its various small activities and its more numerous small curiosities. Mrs. Price Ridley, in her front garden, hastened to the wall as Miss Marple approached, and expressed in one long breath her personal certainty that the young man from the Grange had been taken up, and quite right too. Miss Hartnell, at the post office, opined that Mrs. Ashcombe was to be pitied, but there was no smoke without fire. Miss Marple, having received these opinions with a small, acknowledging inclination of the head, proceeded not to the vicarage, but to the doctor's house, where she was admitted by the doctor's housekeeper into a small sitting-room to await the return of Dr. Haydock from his rounds. Dr. Haydock, when he came, was a spare, weather-tanned man of 60, with kind and shrewd eyes. He removed his hat, laid it upon a bookcase, and sat down without formality. "Miss Marple, this is not, I take it, a social call?" "I am afraid, my dear doctor, that it is not." He looked at her a moment. "The affair at Blackthornne?" "Yes." "You are not satisfied with Inspector Slack's arrest?" "I am not." "Nor am I," said Dr. Haydock. "The wound is a very particular one. It was made, I say this to you alone, with an instrument very like a hairpin, thickened at the point, perhaps by having been driven into a cork or a piece of hard wood. It is not the wound a young man would inflict, unless the young man had a most unusual sense of theatre. It is the wound one associates, if one associates it with anything, with a hand small and steady and used to fine work. "A woman's hand," Miss Marple said. "A woman's hand, or a very careful man's." She was silent a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Haydock, I must ask you something. It concerns an old matter. In the summer of 1902, at the Ashcombs house in Northumberland, Edith Ashcombe was found dead in a garden. There was a wound in her breast. It was said to be self-inflicted. Do you know anything of this?" Dr. Haydock's brows drew together. "I know something. I was a young man then. I was in practice in Alnwick. It was not my case, but I was called in the course of the inquest to give an opinion. The wound was very like the wound Mr. Locksley bears now. I remember I said at the time that I could not see how the young woman had inflicted it upon herself. My opinion was set aside. There was a good deal of pressure from the family, from her brother, Major Ashcombe. It was called a suicide." "Was it in the papers?" "Only in the local papers. A small paragraph. Not, I think, ever elsewhere." Miss Marple sat for a moment with her hands folded. "Doctor, who, apart from yourself, would know of that wound? Who would know it in such detail as to reproduce it?" Dr. Haydock considered. "The family, the coroner, long dead, a nurse who was in attendance. I do not know her name. The Ashcombs housekeeper of the day. Any servant of the household. A young servant, perhaps," Miss Marple said. "Someone who might, 20 years later, have made her way, under another name, into another household." They looked at each other in silence. "You have someone in mind," Dr. Haydock said. "I have a shape in mind," Miss Marple said, "and I have not yet put a face to it. But it will not, I think, be very long." She rose. He rose with her and helped her with her shawl. "Miss Marple, you will be careful." "I am always careful, dear doctor. It is my only virtue." He smiled, briefly, and let her out into the lane. She walked next to the vicarage. It was not the Reverend Ashby she sought, however, but his wife. Mrs. Ashby, in her kitchen, was rolling pastry with a very floured hand. She wiped her hands on her apron at Miss Marple's coming and set the kettle back upon the hob. "Ellen," said Miss Marple, seating herself at the deal table, "I want you to think back. When Cordelia Ashcombe first came to the village, how many years ago?" "Nearly 7, Jane." "And when she came, was she alone in the house? Or was there anyone with her, a maid, a companion, anyone at all whom she had brought from her old home?" Mrs. Ashby set down the flour dredger. "There was a maid, a quiet woman, a widow, I think, who had been with her in Northumberland. She was called Mrs. Dabney. She was here for perhaps 4 years. Then she left. Cordelia told me she had gone to a niece in Scotland. She was replaced, you remember, by young Susan Pruitt, who is with her now." "Mrs. Dabney," Miss Marple said slowly. "Yes, I recall her a little. A grey woman, was she not, with a bandage upon her wrist? She had had a burn, poor thing. She kept the bandage a long time. Ellen, where is Mrs. Dabney now?" "Scotland, I suppose. Cordelia would know. Why, Jane?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was thinking of the small tear in the lace at Mrs. Ashcombe's wrist, of Edith's letter and the small pin taken from her dressing table, of the doctor's word, "a woman's hand, or a very careful man's," of the 12 pins in the enamelled box where there had once been 14. "Ellen," she said, "if a person wished to enter Blackthornne Cottage without being remarked, at what hour would she come?" Mrs. Ashby, without looking up, said, "Between 6 and 7 in the morning, before Susan is down." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I thought so." She rose and thanked Mrs. Ashby for the tea she had not drunk, and went out again. In the lane the sun stood high. The roses on the vicarage wall stirred faintly in the small breeze. Miss Marple walked with her eyes upon the path and her mind upon a woman who wore a bandage upon her wrist, and a smile, Edith had said so, in her last letter, that no one, at the time, had known how to read. Section 7. A Second Shock. Miss Marple did not go directly home. She turned instead at the fork by the Blue Boar and walked the mile of shaded lane that led to the Grange. The Grange was a long, low house of pale stone set behind a yew hedge, and it belonged, since the death of the old colonel, to his nephew Julian Vane, who was at present, one had to remember, in Much Benham, in a room without much furniture, answering questions. She was received by the housekeeper, a Mrs. Marbury, who had known Miss Marple since her own girlhood, and who now stood in the flagged hall with an apron between her hands and a face full of a distress she was too well trained to voice. "Miss Marple, he didn't do it. Master Julian didn't do it." "Mrs. Marbury," Miss Marple said, "I know he did not, but I have come to ask you something. When did Mr. Julian first meet Mrs. Ashcombe?" Mrs. Marbury considered. 2 years past, at the fete. He walked her home along the lane, and he came back with a colour in his cheeks I had not seen before. "And in the year before that, Mrs. Marbury, was there anyone at the Grange with whom she was much acquainted? Any lady with whom she took tea or corresponded?" There was a lady the master had used to write to, from before Mrs. Ashcombe's coming. A lady from London. Very seldom did she come down, but she came once, I remember, in the spring, a Mrs. Thorne. "Mrs. Verity Thorne," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes, miss, but she has not been down since." "Have you her address, Mrs. Marbury?" "There is an address book in the master's desk." "I should be grateful," Miss Marple said, "if I might see it." She was permitted, with the trust of an old acquaintance and the desperation of a housekeeper who feared for her mistress in fact, to enter the Colonel's old study and to open the small leather book upon the writing table. She turned to tea, and she found in the young Mr. Vane's angular hand an address in Bayswater, and beneath it, in a smaller, more recent pencil note, the words, "As of April, care of Blackthornne Cottage." Blackthornne Cottage. Miss Marple closed the book very gently and placed it back where it had lain. She thanked Mrs. Marbury. She promised her, without saying so, that Master Julian would be home before nightfall, and she went out again into the lane. She had not, however, walked half the way back to the village before she was overtaken by the noise of a bicycle bell, and Constable Polk, red-faced and gasping, dismounted beside her. Miss Marple, there has been another. Please, miss, will you come?" Her heart, for one instant, was very cold. "Cordelia?" she said. "No, miss, no. It's the maid, young Susan Pruitt. She has been found in the wash-house." Miss Marple laid her hand for a moment upon the top rail of the nearest gate. Then she said in her ordinary voice, "Lead on, Constable." They went together to Blackthornne at a pace that was, for Miss Marple, exceptional. The inspector was already at the cottage. Susan Pruitt lay quite still upon the flagged floor of the wash-house, which stood in a low outbuilding at the side of the garden. She was a girl of 19, plump and freckled, with a mouth that had in life been given to a great deal of harmless laughter. She had been struck once at the back of the neck, and she had, from the disposition of her body and the state of her hands, put up no resistance whatever. The inspector, when he had seen Miss Marple, drew her aside into the small paved yard by the pump. "Miss Marple, this upsets my hypothesis." "It does, Inspector." "Mr. Julian Vane has been with me all morning at Much Benham. He cannot have done this." "No. The girl was alive at 8. She brought Mrs. Ashcombe her tea at 8. She was found by Mrs. Ashcombe at 10, when Mrs. Ashcombe went to take out the sheets. There is no sign of a struggle. There is no sign of forced entry. There is—" he hesitated. "There is upon her collar a single hair, silver grey, of a length that is not Mrs. Ashcombe's, and not the girl's own." "A woman's hair." "Yes." Miss Marple was silent. In her mind, most cruelly, the shape she had been building deepened, and the shape had a face, and the face was a face she had not yet named, but which had, this morning, taken tea from Cordelia's own hand. She said, "Inspector, may I speak to Mrs. Ashcombe?" "She is in the parlour. She has taken it very hard." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "she would." In the parlour, Cordelia Ashcombe stood at the window. She did not turn when Miss Marple came in. "Jane, it is my fault. It is my fault." "It is not, Cordelia. It is not your fault at all. But you must tell me one thing, and you must tell me now. Mrs. Dabney, your Mrs. Dabney, who was with you in Northumberland, and who left you 4 years ago for a niece in Scotland, have you heard from her since?" Mrs. Ashcombe turned. Her face was white, her mouth trembled. I have had letters." "Recent letters?" "Yes, since the spring." "Where from?" From London. She wrote to say she had come south, that she had taken a room in a boarding house at Bayswater. She wrote to ask after me. She was very kind, Jane. She had always been very kind to me." "Cordelia, when did you last see her?" "I have not seen her. I have only had letters." "You are quite sure?" "Quite sure, Jane." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Cordelia, The lady who came to tea with you 3 weeks ago. The lady you told me was an old school friend, a Mrs. Vinton. That was Mrs. Vinton. Really it was. Jane, I do not lie to you. No, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. You do not lie to me. But I begin to think you have been very often lied to. She sat down. Mrs. Ashcombe sat down opposite her. Beyond the window in the wash-house, Inspector Slack was giving orders in a low voice. A doctor's car came up the lane and stopped. Cordelia, Miss Marple said, I want you to think. In the past few months, since April, say, have you kept your writing desk locked? Not always. Have you had, at any time, a visitor to whom you have shown the letters of Edith? Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes widened. I showed them to Mr. Locksley. He asked to see them. He said his mother had once known Edith. I thought perhaps she had. He read them in this room. I left him alone with them once, when I went to answer the door. Who was at the door? A woman selling lavender, a gypsy woman. A woman selling lavender, Miss Marple repeated softly. I see. They sat a moment in silence. Then Miss Marple said, Cordelia, have you a photograph of Mrs. Dabney? There was one, in the album on the second shelf. They rose together. In the album, on the page marked Northumberland, 1901-1904, was the small faded photograph of a household group upon the steps of a stone house. Edith at the centre in her white dress, the young Major Ashcombe standing at her shoulder, the young Cordelia beside him, and at the edge, a woman servant of perhaps 25, dark-haired, with a long, thin face and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple looked at that face for a long time. She looked at it with a stillness that seemed to Cordelia Ashcombe, at that moment, more terrible than any accusation. Cordelia, she said at last, did Mrs. Dabney, when she came to you in St. Mary Mead 7 years ago, look older than this? Of course, Jane. She was greyer. She had aged. Was she recognisably the same woman? Mrs. Ashcombe stared at the photograph, and then, slowly, she said in a small, dry voice, I have not looked at this picture in years. Jane, is it possible that my Mrs. Dabney was not the Mrs. Dabney of Northumberland at all? It is possible, my dear, said Miss Marple. It is more than possible. And I begin to think that when Mrs. Dabney of Northumberland went to her niece in Scotland, she never in fact went there, and that a different woman, wearing a bandage upon her wrist, took her place in your kitchen, and that woman has been walking softly among us, in one shape or another, for a very long time. Cordelia Ashcombe put her hand over her mouth. In the wash-house beyond the window, the doctor's voice rose and fell. Then who, she whispered, is she? That, Cordelia, Miss Marple said, we shall now find out. Section 8. Miss Marple's Test. Miss Marple returned home by the field path rather than the lane, in order to be for a little while alone. The evening was drawing on. The shadows lay long across the pasture, and the swifts, which had been high all afternoon, had begun to descend to the level of the hedges. She walked slowly, her small handbag pressed against her side, and she was engaged all the way in a very quiet reordering of her thoughts. By the time she reached her own gate, she had made 2 small resolutions. The first was that she would, that evening, invite a party to tea. The second was that she would, before that tea, telephone to Somerset House and to a certain solicitor in Lincoln's Inn whom she had known since he had been a boy in short trousers. The telephone at the post office was at that hour unoccupied, and Mrs. Simmons, the postmistress, was disposed to be helpful in the way of a woman who has correctly guessed that some large piece of village history is unfolding at her switchboard. Miss Marple made her calls with brevity. She spoke to Mr. Petherick in Lincoln's Inn for some 7 minutes. She spoke to a Miss Adderley at Somerset House for a further 4. She emerged from the small wooden booth, thanked Mrs. Simmons, and walked home to compose a note. The note, written in her small, clear hand upon her best paper, was as follows. Dear Ellen, I should be so grateful if you and the vicar would take tea with me tomorrow at 4. I have asked, in the same spirit, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Price Ridley, dear Cordelia, and Mer, because she has been so kind to Cordelia throughout, Mrs. Vinton, of whom Cordelia has often spoken. There is a small matter of no great consequence, upon which I should like the counsel of friends. Yours affectionately, Jane. 4 copies of this note went out at first light next morning, borne by young Tommy Bassett upon his bicycle. A 5th note, in a somewhat different form, went to Inspector Slack at Much Benham, and a 6th was placed upon Miss Marple's own mantel, addressed to no one but Miss Marple herself, and containing a list of 8 small observations which she wished, before the tea, to have arranged in her mind in a particular order. The morning was passed by Miss Marple in her garden. She weeded her herbaceous border, she staked her delphiniums, she watered, with especial care, her hollyhocks. If she thought, as she did so, of another hollyhock, of one which had been permitted to stand, she gave no outward sign of it. At 3 o'clock she went indoors, changed her gardening apron for her second-best grey silk, and set the parlour in order. The chairs she arranged in a rough half-circle. The tea-table she placed in their midst. Upon a smaller side table, near the window, she laid, with an air of the utmost casualness, 3 items: a small enamelled box, an album of photographs, and a very old letter folded once. At 3:45, Cordelia Ashcombe arrived, upon Miss Marple's arm at the gate. She had been persuaded to come only because Miss Marple had walked to Blackthornne to fetch her, and because Miss Marple had said very simply, "You must come, Cordelia. It is the only way." Mrs. Vinton was the last to arrive. She was a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in a soft dove grey, with a face that in youth must have been handsome, and that had settled in age into a network of fine lines about the eyes. She had at her throat a small tortoiseshell brooch that matched the coil of iron-grey hair at the back of her head. She entered the parlour on a light step, greeted each person present with a smile of great sweetness, and took the chair Miss Marple offered her without visible unease. Only Miss Marple, watching from the doorway, observed that she pressed her right wrist briefly with her left hand, in the small, unconscious gesture of a woman who has known, for many years, that a bandage was there. Tea was made, cake was cut. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose social sense had been sharpened by curiosity to a fine point, remarked upon the weather. Dr. Haydock, from his chair by the window, said very little, but watched. Miss Marple, in her own chair, poured out the tea with the composure of a woman who has poured out tea for 50 years. "I have asked you all," she said gently, "because there has been a great deal of distress in the village this week, and it has seemed to me that we owe it to Cordelia to speak together, quietly, of what we know. Inspector Slack has been most patient, but there are certain small matters upon which the village itself, I think, may throw light." There was a general murmur of assent. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple continued, "of Edith Ashcombe, Cordelia's sister-in-law. Some of you never knew her. She died a long time ago in Northumberland. She was a girl of, I believe, 23. I have been thinking of her because it has seemed to me that the manner of Mr. Locksley's death recalls, in certain particulars, the manner of hers." Mrs. Vinton's cup did not tremble, but she set it down. "I have here," Miss Marple went on, and drew towards her from the side table the folded letter, the last letter Edith Ashcombe wrote. She wrote it, I believe, some 3 days before her death. May I read a passage? She did not wait for permission. She read the passage in the mildest of voices, the passage in which Edith spoke of the pin taken from her dressing table and of the smile of a woman she was afraid of. When she had finished, the parlour was very quiet. Somewhere in the garden a thrush sang. "Now," said Miss Marple, "I have also here," she drew the enamelled box towards her, 12 tortoiseshell hairpins from Edith Ashcombe's own dressing case. There should be 14, 2 are missing. One, I believe, was used in Northumberland in the summer of 1902. One, I believe, was used at Blackthornne Cottage in the summer of this year. She lifted the lid of the box. The pins lay upon their red velvet. She did not, however, look at them. She looked at Mrs. Vinton. "Mrs. Vinton," she said, still gently, "you have been such a friend to dear Cordelia this year. She has spoken of you very often. She has said, only yesterday, that you called upon her on the morning of Mr. Locksley's death, at 9:30, and that you took a turn with her in the garden before you went away. Would that be so?" There was a very long pause. Cordelia Ashcombe drew in her breath sharply and half rose. Miss Marple, without looking at her, laid her hand upon her wrist, and Cordelia sat down again. Mrs. Vinton smiled faintly. "I fear, Miss Marple, that dear Cordelia has confused her dates. I called upon her the day before. I was not at Blackthorne on the morning of the tragedy." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "I thought perhaps you had been, because you see, one of my neighbours, old Mr. Podgett, you may not know him, was passing along the lane at 10:15, and he mentioned to me only this morning that he had seen a lady in dove grey turning in at the Blackthorne gate. He is nearly 90, dear Mr. Podgett, and one cannot always attend to what he says. But he has, I have noticed, a very sharp eye for colours." Mrs. Vinton continued to smile, but her right hand had gone again, very briefly, to her left wrist. "I fear Mr. Podgett is mistaken." "That is very possible," Miss Marple said. "Very possible indeed." She did not press the point. She turned instead to the album and opened it upon the arm of her chair at the page marked Northumberland, 1901-1904, and she said, in a voice of the greatest sweetness, "Cordelia was showing me this photograph yesterday. It is such an interesting group. Edith in the centre, Major Ashcombe behind, young Cordelia beside, and here, at the edge, the young woman who was, I think, at that time in the household as a nursery maid. Cordelia does not, curiously, remember her name. Do you, Mrs. Vinton, by any chance recognise her?" Mrs. Vinton did not look at the album. She said, quite steadily, "I am afraid I have never been in Northumberland, Miss Marple." "Ah," Miss Marple said again. "How odd, because I had, only this morning, a communication from Mr. Petherick, my solicitor, a very careful man, and he tells me that a person of the name of Vinton, matching your description in every particular, was in the employ of the Ashcombe family at Alnwick from 1899 to 1903 as a nursery maid, and left that employment upon the death of the young Miss Edith. Mr. Petherick has the papers. It is, of course, quite possible that this is a different Vinton." The parlour was, at that moment, so still that Miss Marple could hear the ticking of her own hall clock through the door. Mrs. Vinton's smile did not falter. It only, very slightly, hardened. "I have," she said quietly, "nothing to add." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, and closed the album. "Nothing at all. We shall speak of other things." She turned to Mrs. Price Ridley and asked her, with an interest that seemed unfeigned, how her nephew was faring at his school in Kent. Mrs. Price Ridley, only too glad, embarked upon a narrative which lasted 7 minutes. But Miss Marple, all the while, was watching Mrs. Vinton's right hand, where it lay upon the arm of the chair. It did not, throughout the 7 minutes, once move, and she knew, in that stillness, that she had, at last, found the hand which had, 34 years before, in a garden in Northumberland, held a hairpin very steadily indeed. Section 9. A quiet assembly of truth. The tea party ended, as such parties do, in a general murmur of thanks. Mrs. Price Ridley pressed Miss Marple's hand at the gate. Dr. Haydock lingered a moment upon the step. The Reverend and Mrs. Ashby went off together down the lane, deep in a low conversation. Cordelia Ashcombe was placed by Miss Marple, gently but firmly, into the care of Mrs. Ashby, with the whispered injunction that she should not be left alone. Mrs. Vinton took her leave last. She thanked Miss Marple with the same soft smile with which she had arrived. She said at the door, "It has been a most interesting afternoon, Miss Marple. I feel I have learned a good deal." "I too, Mrs. Vinton," Miss Marple said. Their eyes met quite briefly, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. It was recognition, and it was also, on Mrs. Vinton's part, a kind of terrible, weary respect. She went away down the lane, upright, with a light step. Miss Marple watched her go from the doorway until she had turned the corner by the Blue Boar. Then she closed the door and went to the window of the parlour and drew the curtain a little to one side. In 3 minutes, precisely as she had hoped, the black Austin of Inspector Slack drew up at the end of the lane, and Constable Polk emerged from a hedge in which he had been sitting since 3:30, with a great deal of patience and a small notebook. Miss Marple let the curtain fall. Dr. Haydock had not, in fact, gone home. He had returned by the back gate, and was now seated in Miss Marple's kitchen, with a cup of the excellent tea to which he had helped himself. "You gave her every chance, Miss Marple." "I gave her every chance, Doctor." "She will not, I think, run." "No, she has never run. She has never needed to. That, you see, is what makes her what she is." "Tell me," Dr. Haydock said quietly. "Tell me now." Miss Marple sat down opposite him. She folded her hands upon the table, and she spoke as she would speak of a piece of embroidery, or a recipe, or the arrangement of flowers upon an altar. Doctor, in the summer of 1902, in the household of the Ashcombs at Alnwick, there was a nursery maid. Her name was, I think, as Mr. Petherick's papers tell me, Verity Vinton. She was 25. She was clever. She was patient. She was, in the particular way of certain patient women, in love with the master of the house. She was in love with Major Ashcombe. The Major, being a young man of no great imagination, did not observe this. He was, in any case, newly married. His young wife, our Cordelia, had come into the house, and had been welcomed by his young sister, Edith, and had settled, so far as anyone knew, quite happily. But Edith was not, poor girl, quite well. She had, what Cordelia has told me now, what I did not know before, she had a certain fixation upon her brother. A fixation of the kind which sometimes develops in young women who have grown up alone, without a mother, in a house of quiet corners and long silences. She wrote him letters. She grew jealous of Cordelia. She began to say, I have seen it in her last letter, that Cordelia was working against her, that Cordelia was taking her hairpins, that Cordelia meant her harm. None of it was true, Doctor. It was Verity Vinton who was working against her. It was Verity Vinton who had taken the pin. She had, I think, hoped for a long time to be more than a nursery maid in that house. She had watched the young wife, and she had watched the young sister, and she had understood, with the quick, clear understanding of a certain kind of mind, that the sister was the weak place in the war. If the sister were made to seem mad, if the sister were made to accuse the wife, if, in the end, the sister died in a way that suggested the wife had done it, then the wife might, in the fullness of time, be removed, and the household would be undone, and Verity Vinton, who was patient, and who had been kind to the Major throughout, would be there. It did not fall out so. Edith was found in the garden. There was a small wound. There was, as Cordelia has just told me, a great deal of family pressure to have it called a suicide, because of Edith's letters and her difficulties. It was called a suicide. The Major, poor Major, believed, at heart, that Cordelia had done it. He never said so, he never accused her, but he began from that summer to keep his little private ledger and to pay, quietly, twice a year, a sum of money to a person whose initial was V, because Verity Vinton had come to him before she left the household and had told him, with tears, that she had seen his young wife walking, on the morning of Edith's death, in the flower bed where Edith was found. Dr. Haydock made a small sound. She blackmailed him, Miss Marple said, for 30 years. She lived, one gathers, quietly in London. She wrote from time to time. She was patient. She was very patient. When the Major died, 5 years ago, the payments should have ended, but she wrote to Cordelia as Mrs. Dabney, whose place she had, we now see, taken, as Mrs. Vinton, an old school friend from Cheltenham, whom Cordelia's tired memory could not quite refuse, as, at times, a woman selling lavender at the door. She kept Cordelia in a certain constant confusion, and she continued to draw sums from the estate through channels I have this morning discussed with Mr. Petherick. She had, in Cordelia, a widow now unsupported, still afraid of a summer 30 years ago, and half persuaded, you saw it yourself, Doctor, that she had, perhaps, in some sleepwalking fashion, done what Edith had accused her of doing. Now this spring there came a difficulty. Mr. Locksley, the illegitimate son of the Major, whose existence had been known to Verity Vinton before it was known to Cordelia, and who had been discovered by Verity in London and set upon Cordelia as one more instrument of pressure, Mr. Locksley began to be greedy on his own account. He came down to St. Mary Mead. He proposed, one gathers, to settle himself in Cordelia's house permanently, upon terms of his own. He proposed also, this is my inference, from certain scraps in the Black Ledger, to blackmail Verity Vinton in her turn. He had, in London, learned enough of her to threaten her. And so, Doctor, on the morning of the 12th of June, Verity Vinton came, as an old friend, to take a turn in the garden with Cordelia, who was upstairs, sorting linen, and finding Mr. Locksley alone in the flower bed, she killed him with a small, sharp instrument she had brought in her handbag. She had brought it, I feel sure, thinking she might use it against Cordelia if the moment offered. It offered against him instead. She laid him among the hollyhocks. She trod down the flowers upon one side only, because she wished the eye to travel along that path, and to think of him as fallen. She placed at his shoulder a hairpin, Edith's pin, of which she had kept 2, from that summer in Alnwick, all these years, because she wished, in her cold and elaborate soul, to leave a mark upon Cordelia that only Cordelia could read, a message that said, "I am here still, and it is you the world will suspect." And when the maid, poor Susan Pruitt, told her mistress, on the morning of the second death, that she had let a lady in dove grey in at 9:30 on the morning of the first, for Susan had seen her, one gathers, and had thought nothing of it, because Mrs. Vinton was known. Then Verity Vinton, who had come back to the house on some pretext of comfort, took the girl aside into the wash-house and made sure that Susan Pruitt should tell no one else. Dr. Haydock did not for a moment speak. He had set down his cup, and his hands lay open upon the table. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "you will forgive me. It is a story to make the blood cold." "It is only," Miss Marple said, "one of the oldest of all stories, Doctor. A patient woman in the wrong place, and the years at last taking their long and terrible interest." They sat a moment. Outside, the light was fading. A moth beat once against the pane. "You have," Dr. Haydock said, "no direct proof." "I have," Miss Marple said, "her right hand." "Her right hand?" "She has held it, Doctor, all her life, a little too still. There is a burn upon the wrist from a kettle in Alnwick in 1902. Edith mentions it in a letter I did not read to you today. Cordelia's Mrs. Dabney had such a burn also, and Mrs. Vinton, in my parlour this afternoon, pressed her wrist when she was uneasy with her left hand, a habit one does not lose. Inspector Slack will find the burn. He will find, too, in her lodgings in Bayswater, letters which she has kept for 30 years, for she is a woman who keeps everything. She has kept, I have no doubt, the second pin. And there is Cordelia's testimony that Mrs. Vinton called upon her the day before, and mine that old Mr. Podgett saw her in the lane on the morning itself, and the parlour-maid at the Grange, who let her in 3 weeks ago to see Master Julian upon a false pretext, and heard her ask, incidentally, where Mrs. Ashcombe kept the key of her writing desk. She rose. Dr. Haydock rose with her. "Poor Cordelia," he said. "Poor Cordelia. Poor Edith. Poor Mr. Locksley, who was not, in the end, wicked enough for the company he had chosen. And poor Susan Pruitt, who only opened a door." They went into the hall together. The hall clock struck 7. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked. The Blue Boar's shutters clattered as they were closed for the night. And along the lane from Blackthornne, distantly, came the small, measured sound of Inspector Slack's Austin, returning at last to Much Benham, with a woman in dove grey seated quietly in the back. Miss Marple stood on her step and watched it pass. She did not go out to it. There was, at that moment, no need. Section 9 has ended. Section 10. The Reveal. It was late that night before Miss Marple had the opportunity to explain, in her own way and at her own pace, the whole shape of the matter to Cordelia Ashcombe. Mrs. Ashby had brought Cordelia to Miss Marple's house, and the two of them, with Dr. Haydock in his chair by the window and Inspector Slack in the seat opposite, made up the small, quiet company to whom, at last, everything was told. Cordelia had put her hands over her face when Verity Vinton was taken away. She had not wept. She had said only, "Then it was not I. Then it was never I." "It was never you, my dear," Miss Marple had said. "It was never you at all." Now, in the lamplight of Miss Marple's parlour, with the curtains drawn against the night, they sat around the small table, and Miss Marple, at Inspector Slack's request, went once more through her reasoning, not this time in the mildness of an accusation, but in the plain sequence of a story to be understood. "There were," she began, "3 particular things which struck me at the beginning, and to which I kept returning. The first was the hollyhock which had been permitted to stand. If Mr. Locksley had been struck down in the ordinary course of a struggle, the flower behind his shoulder would have been broken. It was not. It stood upright, at the base of it a small tortoise-shell hairpin, quite clean, quite unbent. That told me 2 things. It told me first that Mr. Locksley had not fallen, he had been laid. And it told me second that the person who had laid him had taken care to preserve one flower in order that the pin at its foot should be observed. It was, in its way, a signature. The second was Cordelia herself, sitting upon the stone bench in her front garden with her hands folded, and a small tear in the lace at her wrist. She was too composed. It is not the composure of guilt, Inspector, you thought at first that it was, but the composure of a woman who has, for a great many years, been asked to consider whether she is capable of a crime she did not commit. Such a woman, when a crime does happen in her garden, does not cry out. She sits down. She has, in some sense, been waiting for it all her life. The third was the small, pale line upon the third finger of Mr. Locksley's right hand, where a ring had lately been. It was a signet, I think, and he had removed it before coming into this village. That told me that Mr. Locksley was concealing a personal history, most likely, I thought, a family history. It suggested, in fact, that he was closer to the Ashcombes than the story of a distant cousin allowed. From these three things, Inspector, and from the doctor's observation that the wound had been made with something like a hairpin, thickened for the purpose, and from the medical similarity, which he has been so kind as to confirm, between Mr. Locksley's wound and the wound Edith Ashcombe bore in 1902, I was led, at length, to the notion of an old crime repeating itself. When one considers old crimes repeating themselves, one must ask, who, in the case, has a memory of that old crime detailed enough to reproduce its manner? The answer, in this case, could only be a person who had been in that Northumberland household in 1902. Cordelia was there. So was the Major, now dead. So was the housekeeper, now dead. So was a nursery maid, one Verity Vinton, who left the house after Edith's death and vanished into a long, patient obscurity in London. When I had learned from dear Mrs. Ashby that Cordelia's Mrs. Dabney had left in circumstances which no one had ever quite verified, a niece in Scotland is so very useful, is she not, when one wishes not to be inquired after, and when I had seen the photograph of the household group at Alnwick, and when I had learned from Mrs. Marbury at the Grange that a Mrs. Verity Thorne of London had called upon Master Julian only 3 weeks ago, and had, at that time, contrived to ask where in Blackthornne Cottage Mrs. Ashcombe kept her writing desk, then, Inspector, I had my shape. A woman of remarkable patience, of many names, Vinton, Dabney, Thorne, Vinton again, who had used first blackmail and then, when blackmail became inconvenient, murder, and who had chosen, at the crucial moment, to walk in dove-grey up a lane in a small village on a summer's morning. She had a further motive at Blackthorne, of course. Mr. Locksley had begun to be greedy on his own account, and to threaten her. He had known her, in London, as Verity Thorne. He had come to St. Mary Mead intending, as I now believe, to use his knowledge of her past to secure himself a place at Blackthorne, and to divide the spoil with her upon his own terms. She was not, however, a woman who divided. On the morning of the 12th, she came to Blackthorne as an old friend, at 9:15. Susan Pruitt let her in. Cordelia was upstairs. Mrs. Vinton, saying she would not disturb her, went into the garden by the side door, where Mr. Locksley, as she had known he would be, for she had known his habits from 3 weeks of watching, was taking his coffee. She spoke to him. Perhaps she gave him some assurance. Perhaps she offered him something. When his back was turned, she used the small instrument which had lain, all the way from Bayswater, in the lining of her handbag. She laid him in the flower bed. She placed the pin. She went out at the side gate. She was in the lane, walking back toward the village, by 9:30, and old Mr. Podgett, coming up the lane in the opposite direction with his cart, tipped his hat to her, and thought her a fine, dove-grey lady on a fine morning, and remembered, because he is old, and observes such things, the exact colour of her sleeve. She had no reason, then, to strike again. But young Susan Pruitt had let her in that morning, and Susan Pruitt, when she was questioned by Inspector Slack, would remember it. The inspector had been so focused on the first day upon Mr. Julian Vane that Susan had not been asked. Mrs. Vinton, however, had been reading the inspector as one reads a newspaper. She knew he would in time come to Susan. She could not afford it. Yesterday morning, therefore, she came back to Blackthorne, on the pretext, one gathers, of bringing lavender water for Cordelia's nerves. Cordelia was in the parlour with Mrs. Ashby. Susan was in the wash-house. Mrs. Vinton stepped in there for a moment, only a moment, and Susan, who trusted her, turned her back to lift a sheet from the copper. It was very quickly done. Inspector Slack was writing steadily. He did not look up. "There is," Miss Marple continued gently, "one further matter. The letters Mr. Locksley had upon him, signed "Your ever devoted E." Those, Inspector, were Edith's letters, taken by Verity Vinton from Alnwick 34 years ago and preserved by her. She had given them, or lent them, to Mr. Locksley, as one gathers, part of his supposed inheritance, to bring with him to St. Mary Mead. She left them upon him because she knew that they would at first be read as love letters between him and Cordelia, and would darken the case against Cordelia. So too she left the pin, which, as she knew, would in due course be identified as Edith's, and which would, if the police thought clearly enough about it, suggest that Cordelia, having killed her sister-in-law long ago with just such a pin, was killing again. Cordelia Ashcombe drew a long, slow breath. "She hated me," she said, in a voice of wonder. "She hated you, my dear, from the day the Major married you. She spent 30 years of her life in the small, patient dismantling of yours. She was very nearly successful." There was a silence in the parlour. Dr. Haydock from his chair said quietly, "The 2 pins, the 2 wounds, 34 years. It is the coldest thing I have ever heard of, Miss Marple." "It is not," Miss Marple said, "cold, Doctor. It is only very old. There was, in Verity Vinton, a heat that never spoke. She loved once, and she was not noticed, and she became a woman who spent her life in noticing other people to their ruin. I have seen it before. Not, I hope, on this scale, but I have seen it before." Inspector Slack laid down his pen. "Miss Marple, there will be a great deal to do. I am obliged to you, more than I can say. Mr. Julian Vane is at home, by the way, since 7 o'clock. I sent pork myself." "That was kind of you, Inspector." He rose, took his hat, and went out. His car turned in the lane and receded. Mrs. Ashby, seeing the hour, rose too, and took Cordelia's arm. She would sleep that night at the vicarage. At the door, Cordelia turned. She took Miss Marple's small, dry hand in both her own, and held it a moment without speaking. "Jane," she said. "Edith, do you think she has been, all this time, waiting for someone to know?" "I think, my dear," Miss Marple said, "that she was afraid all her life of a woman who smiled at her, and that at the last we, in our small village, have been able to give her a little of the truth. It is not much, but it is not nothing." Cordelia Ashcombe bent and kissed her upon the cheek, and Miss Marple, whose eyes were often bright in the evenings, did not, at that moment, trust herself to speak. Section 11. Aftermath. The Hollyhocks in September. Summer passed in St. Mary Mead in its accustomed way. The wheat in the fields beyond the church turned first pale, then gold, then a great rustling stubble. The swifts that had descended to the level of the hedges rose again, one dry afternoon, and were gone. And the shadow that had lain for a little while upon the lane by Blackthornne cottage lifted, as such shadows do in villages, by imperceptible degrees, until it was a matter for the winter fireside rather than the noon. Mrs. Ashcombe closed Blackthornne for a month, and went to a cousin at Torquay. She returned in August, thinner than she had gone, but with the beginnings of a colour in her face which Miss Marple had not seen for some years. She went with Miss Marple, one evening in early September, to lay flowers upon a certain grave in the churchyard, and there, without ceremony and without tears, she told Miss Marple that she had had, at last, in the night in Torquay, a dream of Edith, in which Edith had walked with her along a garden path, and had, at parting, taken her hand. "She was not afraid of me, Jane," Cordelia said. "I do not think she ever was, in truth. She was afraid all along of somebody else." "I know it, my dear." They stood a while at the grave. It was a grey stone, weathered smooth. There was only a name and 2 dates and a single line beneath. "In the fields, beside still waters." Cordelia had planted at the head of the stone a hollyhock. It stood that September evening, upright and pink, and its topmost bloom moved a little in the wind. Mr. Julian Vane came home from a summer abroad. He had been sent by an understanding trustee to Italy for 2 months, upon the reasoning that a young man wrongly suspected of murder is best for a while out of a village which has enjoyed suspecting him. He returned brown and grave, and in the first week of September he called upon Mrs. Ashcombe at Blackthornne, and they walked together in the lane, and Miss Marple, watching from her front garden, did not smile. She was not, she would have said, a smiling old woman, but she straightened, in a small gesture of satisfaction, a hollyhock that had inclined a little too far towards the path. Verity Vinton was brought to trial in the autumn. She spoke very little at the proceedings. She wore, throughout, dove grey, and she pressed, from time to time, her left hand upon her right wrist, in that small habit which had, at last, been her undoing. She was sentenced to a term of penal servitude for the murder of Susan Pruitt, of which she was directly convicted, and for the murder of Edmund Locksley, of which she was convicted upon evidence which included Mr. Petherick's investigations at Somerset House, the black leather ledger of the late Major Ashcombe, the letters found in her Bayswater lodgings, and the second tortoiseshell hairpin, kept for 34 years in a small tin at the back of a drawer. The old case of Edith Ashcombe was not, in the end, formally reopened. It was said, by those who had followed the matter, that the county authorities had been informed that a certain private memorandum had been placed upon the file, and that Verity Vinton, if she should ever, in the fullness of years, be released, would find no employment awaiting her in any household in England. It was, Miss Marple thought, a small and quiet justice, but old crimes, she reflected, seldom receive great and loud ones. Inspector Slack, in the weeks that followed, called twice upon Miss Marple. On the second occasion, in the middle of September, he brought her a bunch of hollyhocks from his own garden, which he laid, without much explanation, upon her hall table. "Miss Marple," he said in the porch, "I am not, as you know, a demonstrative man." "You are not, Inspector." "I have been in the past less than gracious to you upon certain occasions." "You have not, dear Inspector, you have merely been busy." He smiled, an unwilling, sudden smile which changed his face. "I have wondered," he said, "since the summer, what it is that you do that I do not." Miss Marple considered him a moment, her head slightly to one side. "I think, Inspector," she said, "that you look at people to find out whether they have done a thing. I look at people to find out who they are. It is a difference of habit rather than of skill. I have had, you see, so much more time." He looked at her a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat and went away down the path, and did not, that year, say more. At the vicarage, one Sunday in late September, the Reverend Ashby preached a sermon which was not, superficially, about any of these matters. He took his text from the 6th chapter of Matthew, and spoke of the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. He spoke of the ways in which those who trust anxiously in themselves are often the last to see what is around them, and of the ways in which those who trust quietly in the ordinary world are often, at last, the true observers of it. He looked, once, in the course of the sermon, at Miss Marple in her accustomed pew, and Miss Marple, who was in the habit of dividing her Sunday attention rigorously between the vicar and her prayer book, looked, once, at him. Nothing else was said, or needed to be. Mrs. Price Ridley, going out, remarked that it had been a peculiarly moving sermon, though she was not entirely sure why. The hollyhocks along Miss Marple's garden wall came at last to the end of their long, patient summer. The topmost blooms browned, dropped, went to seed. Miss Marple, on a morning of high wind, gathered the pods into a paper bag with the care of a woman who had, in her long life, saved a great many seeds, and she wrote upon the bag, in her small, clear hand, "Hollyhocks, Blackthornne strain, sow in April." She did not, that year, speak much of the summer's events. Cordelia Ashcombe and Julian Vane were married the following spring, in the village church, upon a morning of mild rain. Miss Marple, at the wedding, wore her lavender coat and her second-best hat, and gave to the bride, as her wedding gift, a small enamelled box containing 12 tortoiseshell hairpins upon a bed of red velvet. Only Cordelia understood the gift, and Cordelia, on receiving it, held Miss Marple a long moment, and then went, alone, to a certain grave in the churchyard, and laid the box for 1 minute upon the stone, and took it up again, and carried it home. The village, meanwhile, moved on. It bore, as villages do, the memory of the summer of the hollyhocks in the manner of an old brooch in a drawer, put away, but not forgotten, occasionally taken out and considered, and, upon consideration, put back. New troubles came, in due course, a matter of a lost brooch at the vicarage, a scandal about a curate, a difficulty over the churchyard yews. Miss Marple attended to each of them in her turn, but on evenings in the late summer, when the air was still and the lamps had not yet been lit, she would sometimes stand at her front gate and look down the lane, past the elms, towards Blackthornne Cottage, and she would think, not without sorrow, of a young woman in Northumberland 34 years ago, who had written to her brother that she was afraid of a smile, and of a widow sitting upon a stone bench with her hands folded and a small tear in the lace at her wrist, and of a young maid who had, at 9:30 one morning, opened a door to a lady she knew. She would think of all these, and of the small and terrible patience by which one soul, for want of being loved, had made itself a kind of dark craftsman of the lives of others. And she would think, too, that in the ordinary morning traffic of a village, the cart on the lane, the boy running with his boots in his hand, the vicar's cat upon the wall, there ran always, if one had the humility to observe it, the thread by which even the oldest and darkest patterns might in the end be brought into the light. The hollyhocks nodded gently along the wall. Miss Marple presently went indoors, drew her curtains against the coming dark, and took up from the arm of her chair her knitting, upon which the rose at last was very nearly finished. The end.